So
I don't want your phones in the shop though.
good morning and
Good
welcome.
morning
To,
and welcome to.
Put your phone down.
Put
I
your phone
can't
on
read
the
it.
ground. You're
Good
supposed to
morning
memorize.
and welcome to Grayscape.
No, start again because I was talking.
Yeah, I can't see your phone. Yeah, your phone out.
Good morning. Wait.
There we go.
Good morning and welcome to Grayscape. We are so glad that you are joining us here this morning.
That's right. Over the past 4 weeks here online, we have been exploring this whole idea of defiant joy. No matter what is happening, no matter what our circumstances, we hope that you've been enjoying the series and what people have been sharing and the different creatives and all that kind of stuff. But today is our final installment, as Lucas said. Since we have moved into level 2, we've actually been able to kind of experience more things like coffee and spending time with people and like I'm doing with Luke right now, spending time with Luke. Lucas,
Yes, Jordan.
what's been bringing you joy this week?
Being back at the Grayscape Centre has been great.
Come on.
Being back at school as well, seeing all my friends, it's really nice.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, that's
what's
cool,
been
man.
bringing me joy? What's been bringing you joy?
Yeah. What's been bringing me joy is we've been doing a lot of filming stuff.
Yes.
A lot of creative things that you're going to be seeing later today in this program, which I'm very excited about because it looks really nice. Team, we can't actually wait until we can meet together in the Grayscape building. It's going to be very exciting. It's going to be a crazy celebration and party, and we cannot wait to see your fantastic faces. I don't know about you, but I've been missing the faces of Grayscape, the people. But for the time being, we obviously can't meet, so we're meeting in houses, whereas we're still doing stuff online. But keep an eye out on our Instagram, keep an eye out on all the social medias, and if you're not following Grayscape on Facebook or on Instagram, or even our newsletter, we really want to encourage you to follow us there, because that's where we're going to give out all the updates of when we are potentially even moving into the building.
So, we would like to encourage you guys to keep connecting with each other.
Yeah.
Even if it's going out for dinner, playing games, or just hanging out.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's keep our community strong.
Yes.
We know that we're better together.
Oh, come on. The cheese is real. The cheese is real.
Yes.
Cute.
Enjoy the program, team.
Yes.
Alright, I'm gonna...
Church, we are so excited. We finally have worship. How exciting is this? And we're so stoked that you've joined us today. Look, be gracious. This is our first time doing it, okay? This is our first time recording and all that kind of stuff. And we hope that as you guys are sitting or standing in your homes, that you'll join us with worship. I know it's a little bit weird. I know we're not in the building, but this is a great opportunity for us to worship together online. So we're going to sing a few songs, and we'd love for you guys to join us in your homes. So let's sing.
Give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. Pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. Pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord.
Today we are wrapping up our Defiant Joy series, and I've never actually connected the word defiant and joy together before, but I really like it, and I don't know what comes to mind for you when you hear the word defiant, but what I think of is Rocky. I don't know if you've seen the Rocky movies, but if you haven't, please Google Rocky 1, round 14, not now, after this message. It is awesome. It's the scene where Rocky is fighting Apollo Creed, and Apollo Creed kind of just keeps punching him, and then he knocks him down, and then you have Rocky kind of falling to his knees, and in that moment you hear Rocky's coach, and he's like, down, stay down, and Rocky gets back up, and he's like, cut me open, and they do, and he kind of keeps fighting, and I love that image of kind of getting knocked down, but getting back up and just fighting regardless of what punches Apollo Creed has thrown at him. And I think that's what's so unique about Defiant Joy is that we know from experience and even from the last few weeks that life has the habit of kind of throwing punches at us, and often it's actually in the areas of our life that we value most, that we treasure most, and we know that life sometimes throws punches hard and repeatedly and constantly, and it's in those moments we need not just a joy that's based on emotions that fluctuates, but actually a joy that's resilient, that gets back up, that can handle some of those punches and actually still be defiant in the face of it. So the question really is, how do we find that joy? How do we cultivate that? Where can we actually go and search for a joy that's not just an emotion, but that's defiant, that's resilient, that's Rocky 1, round 14 joy? Now, there are many examples, and there are people throughout history that have showed and cultivated this. But one guy that we've been looking at in particular over the last few weeks is a guy called Paul. And what I love about Paul is he doesn't just model and talk about this defiant joy, but he actually tells us how he got to this place as well. And if you have missed this series so far, Paul is currently in prison as he writes this letter that we've been journeying through. And he's in prison, and he's actually awaiting trial under one of Rome's most brutal emperors ever, a guy called Nero. And he's awaiting trial, finding himself in a sticky situation, and yet he writes this letter of joy, in which he makes a statement that really, to me, seems like one of the craziest statements in the entire Bible. If you reckon the Bible has some pretty out there things, this statement really, to me, is kind of one of the most extreme statements, and one of the most relevant and applicable to all of us who want to cultivate lives of joy. And Paul writes this, And he says that I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances in my life. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And I think this is, I don't know what you're thinking when you read this, but to me this is extreme. This is to be content, to learn the secret of contentment regardless of our circumstances, regardless whether we're in lockdown in level 4 or level 2 or level 50, regardless whether how our health is doing, how our relationships are functioning, regardless how people are treating us, to experience a joy that's independent of circumstances. And I wonder, Paul, how did you cultivate this? How did you learn this? Because I think the word learn implies that it's something that he had to lean into, something that he had to apply, something that came over time as he applied some principles in his life. And the cool thing for us is everything leading up to this verse have actually kind of given us an indication of what are those things that Paul have implemented to get him to this place where he's experiencing a joy that's not dependent upon his circumstances, but that's defiant, that's resilient. And today we're really just going to look at 3 very basic principles that he's shared with us so far in this book. And the first one of them is actually from one of the passages that Zal spoke about in week 2, but I think it's incredibly practical. So the first thing that Paul shares, as he learned the secret of being content in every circumstances, how he kind of got to this place of defiant joy, the first thing that he shares with us is a principle of surrender. Now the word surrender is one that tends to not sit very well with us. I think when we read surrender, we kind of often think that it will restrict our freedom. And yet what Paul have actually experienced is that surrender for him did the exact opposite. And I think, and I'll share with you now exactly where Paul shares that. But this idea that Paul shares is one where defiant joy actually requires surrender from us. Now, none of us really like this idea of surrender very much, and yet all of us do this every single day of our lives. Every day we surrender to something. Every day we surrender our joy to some things in our life, whether it's what people say about us, whether it's the amount of likes we have on Instagram, whether it's our health, whether it's the weather. We all daily, whether it's the situation with COVID-19, whatever it is, we tend to surrender our joy to certain circumstances in our life. And what Paul teaches us here is actually that we have to be careful what we surrender our joy to, because, and please don't miss this, because what and who we surrender our joy to will determine how defiant our joy will be. So Paul's saying when we surrender our joy to circumstances that fluctuate, then our joy will be an emotion that fluctuates. But if we want defiant, resilient joy, then we can only surrender to something or someone that kind of stands outside of, someone that stands above the circumstances of our lives. So what was it that Paul surrendered to that allowed him to have defiant joy? Paul writes this statement, and Zal shared this in one of the weeks, where he talks about these people that are kind of spreading these stories that are actually making it harder for him in prison. And this is what he writes about it. He says, some people suppose that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. And I love that, because I think most of us kind of get stuck in that first part where we're so focused on circumstances outside of our control. And yet Paul says none of those things actually matter. The only thing that matters to me is whether Christ, whether this message about Jesus is actually going out and reaching people. And the thing about this is that Paul has actually already surrendered his life to Christ. Paul has already actually surrendered his life to God and said, doesn't matter what happens to me, doesn't matter what I go through, I'm gripped by this love that God has for me, and I want to love God, and I want to love people, and I want to serve people, and I want to make a difference, and regardless what it costs me, I have already committed my life to this higher calling, this vision to actually make sure that other people get lifted up and that Christ gets preached, that this message about Jesus goes out. And so in this place of surrender, Paul is actually experiencing freedom now. And that's why he can stand in this place and have a joy that's resilient, because actually he's no longer dependent upon the circumstances of his life to dictate the level of joy that he's experiencing, but actually because he's surrendered to God and to this God that somehow stands above all the circumstances in his life, and yet is deeply invested in it, because he surrendered to God in this mission to love people and love God. Because of that, his joy is actually resilient, is defiant. It's that rocky joy that can stand strong in the midst of his circumstances. So the first thing I think that Paul teaches us is that defiant joy requires surrender. It requires us to surrender. But he would say, be careful who and what you surrender to, because who you surrender to will determine how defiant your joy will be. The second thing that Paul teaches us on this journey of experiencing defiant joy is this idea of actually taking responsibility. Taking responsibility. Now, the word responsibility means a whole lot of different things in different cultures, even in our culture. But at the very root of it, responsibility consists of two words. And it really is simple, simply the ability that we have to respond. Response able. We are response able. We are able to choose our response in the face of our circumstances. I love sport, and one of the reasons I do is because I think it teaches us so much about life. And there's this guy called Urban Meyer. He's a American football coach in the States. And he introduced this idea, this equation to his team as they were kind of trying to find ways to be a better American football team. And this is what he taught them, this equation. He says the events that happen to you plus your response will determine the outcome of the game. But I think this is true for life as well. Unfortunately, I think most of us kind of live our lives with this mindset, subconsciously perhaps, that actually the events in our life lead to the outcome. And somehow we kind of miss this middle bit. Somehow we forget that we actually have response ability. We are response able. We can choose our response in the face of our circumstance. There's a guy called Viktor Frankl. You may have heard of him. He's one of the Holocaust survivors. He's been through some incredible things in his life, and he was an Austrian psychologist. And he said this. He said, between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. And in this response lies our growth and our freedom. I love that this guy that's been through so much in his life says, we tend to think of it like this, where there's an event in our life and that leads to who we become. But actually, that's a lie, because in this middle, there's a space, there's a gap. There is a responsibility on us to fill that space with whatever we want the outcomes of our lives to be. And I think when we apply it to our context currently in which we find ourselves, if we go to the next slide, we all want defiant joy. That's the outcome that we all want in our lives. A joy that's resilient, that can stand the circumstances in our life. And yet we allow events in our life to dictate with the extent to which we're experiencing this joy. And so for some of us, it's things like the weather, it's what's happening in our country with COVID-19, it's what so-and-so said about me. For Paul, it could have been, how long am I going to be in these chains? This list is endless of events, of things that happen in our life. that we allow to determine the level of joy we experience, yet in the middle lies this responsibility that we have where we can choose how we respond to it. Now, I had to set up the context for that, because look at how Paul responds to the events in his life. He's in chains. These are things that have happened to him, and yet he experiences defiant joy because of this response, the extent to which he has chosen to be response able and chooses response. This is what he says. He uses this phrase after he talks about some of the struggles that he's been through, which is endless, by the way. He was shipwrecked. He was experiencing torture after torture, beating after beating, almost to the point of death. He talks about sleepless nights, of being cold and hungry, not having food. The list of his adversities were endless. And in the midst of this, he writes this statement where he says, "Yet I am put here for the defense of the gospel." I am put here for the defense of the gospel. And gospel is kind of a very churchy word, but it really just means this message of who Jesus is, this good news that God loves us, that God has a plan and a purpose for his life. And he says, I'm put here in prison to defend this gospel. Which is so interesting to me, because the Jews were the ones that arrested Paul, and they didn't put him there to defend the gospel. In fact, they wanted to stamp out this message that he was preaching. The Romans, they were the ones that actually imprisoned him, and yet they didn't put him there to defend the gospel. They didn't even believe in Jesus themselves. Nero was the emperor at the time, and his laws were the reason that Paul was in prison, yet Nero didn't put him there to defend the gospel. So why does Paul say that he was put there to defend the gospel? I would say he was put there to await trial. But I think what Paul is doing here is that he's actually filling that space. He's filling the gap between event and outcome with his response, where he says, you know what? I am put here for the defense of the gospel. What Paul does in this moment is he puts a label of purpose on the season of adversity that he finds himself in. And so Paul is saying, I'm not going to waste the season that I'm in. I'm not going to waste these events that happened in my life. They were outside of my control. I'm not going to waste it, but I'm going to choose my response in the midst of it. And that is that there is purpose to what I'm going through. I'm going to put a label of purpose in the middle of my adversity right now. And I love that, because Wes has been talking a lot lately about how we shouldn't waste the season that we're in. But really, I love that because it applies to all adversity in our life. We can choose whether we let that go to waste, or whether we put a label of purpose that allows God to actually use that for good in our life. And so Paul finds himself in a situation that he didn't choose, that he didn't want, yet he says, I'm going to allow God to use this. I'm not going to waste these chains. I'm not going to waste the bad relationship that I was in. I'm not going to waste my health struggles. I'm not going to waste my financial struggles. I'm not going to waste it, but I'm going to ask God to use this for a greater purpose in my life. And so the first couple of things that I think Paul wants us to know in pursuit of this defiant joy is, firstly, to choose surrender, but to choose surrender wisely, who we surrender to. The second thing is to take responsibility. We all have it. It's just whether we exercise it in our lives or not. To be response able and actually choose what we make of the season we find ourselves in. And then the last thing, the third one that I think Paul, and there are more, if you want more awesome nuggets of wisdom, go and read the whole book. It's great. But the last one that I want to touch on today is one where Paul talks about us choosing our focus, to choose our focus. And Paul writes this verse that I love, where he says this, if we go to the next one, where Paul says, so he's just talked to us about how kind of he has surrendered to God, and how it's okay that people are gossiping about him, because really God is still this message of Jesus is still gonna spread because of it. And then he says, and because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. And I love that second part, Because to me, that is defiance. That is defiant joy, where he says, I actually don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know what's going to happen with my circumstance, but I'm choosing defiant joy in the midst of it. And then Paul writes something after this, where he uses this phrase where he says, I eagerly expect and hope. Now, this phrase is really interesting because this is how it was translated to us in English. But the Bible wasn't written in English originally, and this part was written in Greek. And so the Greek word that Paul uses here is apokaradokia. And I've shared this maybe a year or two ago, so if you can remember it, then that is awesome. But apokaradokia, which translates for us into English as eagerly expect and hope. But this word consists of three different words, one being apo, one being kara, and one being dokia. And apo means from or of, kara means head or mind, and dokia means to look or to watch. And so what Paul is saying here, and you can almost see it visually, how Paul does this. So scholars say what this word actually means is actually someone whose attention is turned away from all other objects and interests and actually fixed upon, concentrated upon something else. So this idea of actually taking your mind off of one thing and fixing it and deliberately fixing it upon something else. And so you can almost see and imagine Paul being in prison here, being stuck in these chains, like stuck in next to these guards in a situation that he doesn't know how long it's going to last for. And he says, you know what, if I focus on these chains, if I focus on my circumstances, if I focus on what's going wrong, I'm going to lose hope. So instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to choose to focus on something else. I'm actually going to take my mind off of these chains and onto something that's greater, something that's bigger, someone that stands outside of what I'm going through, yet someone who cares about it, who cares about me. And so Paul does, he changes his focus from his circumstances onto a God who's bigger than his circumstances. And I think this is a principle that we all know, but that's so important that for every single one of us, there are things in our life that we wouldn't have chosen, things that we wish were different, things that we hope would end soon. And for every single one of us, there are things that are good, things that are helpful, things that are lifting and building us up. And we choose which one we focus on. We choose our focus. We choose where we pay our attention, and that will determine the extent to which we're experiencing joy in our lives. And so I love this because in this moment, as Paul writes this image of apokaradokia, what Paul does is he actually sets himself free. Paul is in prison, but he actually sets himself free from the prison of bitterness and resentment. He sets himself free from feeling sorry for himself. He sets himself free from this victim mentality where we tend to find ourselves thinking that the whole world is against us. Paul actually sets himself free from having to wait for his circumstance to change before he experiences joy. And Paul says, you know what? I'm in chains, but my mind is free. My mind is free. I get to choose what I focus on. I'm not a hostage. I'm not a hostage to my situation. I'm not a hostage to people's opinions of me. I'm not a hostage to what happens in my life because my mind is free to choose what I focus on. And Paul confirms that this decision that he's made to fix his focus on what's good in his life, Paul confirms that in chapter 4. And I love this verse, and you may have heard this before, where Paul says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about those things. Think about those things. I love it. He says, doesn't matter what you're going through, there are things that are true, there are things that are good, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable. There are good things in your life, but you get to choose whether that's what you focus on or not. You get to choose your mindset. You get to choose what you pay attention to. And then the next verse, Paul writes this, and he says, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me. Whatever we've discussed in this series of Defiant Joy, whatever principles we've uncovered, whatever you've heard from me, put it into practice. Put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. And I love this verse because none of what I've said today, or even what we've covered in this series, is really that revolutionary in and of itself. Nothing that we have said will change your life. Nothing will produce defiant joy in our lives unless we actually put it into practice, unless we actually hear these principles and start applying it in our life the way Paul did. He said at the start, I've learned the secret of being content. In other words, it took some effort, it took some practice, it took some actually application of some of these principles to get to this place where I can now say, my joy is defiant, my joy is independent of my circumstances. And so I don't know which one of the three principles you feel like you have to put in practice today. Maybe for you, this idea of surrender is a hard one. This idea of actually surrendering to someone that is bigger than your circumstances. But maybe that is something that you feel like you can practice, you can put in place to experience a joy that's defiant, a joy that's independent of circumstances. Or maybe for you, it's this idea of being being able to choose your response in the face of adversity. Or maybe it's this idea of actually choosing your focus. Maybe you've been so focused on what hasn't been going great in your life that you've missed some of the good things that God has actually provided in your life. To actually close off this entire series, I want to share one last verse with you, and really this verse is the thing upon which this whole series hinges. Everything that we've talked about, all these principles, really, they mean nothing without this verse. And I think the reason this verse is so important is because joy is easy when life is good. But this idea of defiant joy is actually one that says, actually, when life is not that good, I still want to carry joy. I still want to be able to be an influence and a presence and lead people around me in the right direction, even if life doesn't go the way I wanted it to go. But I know that there are some people in our community, some people even listening to this. I know that this has been a tough season for a lot of people, that there have been adversities and heartaches and battles that you faced even in the last few weeks. And I know that it was the case for Paul as well. And I know at times it's easy when we then read this idea of contentment that's independent of circumstances, for that to kind of feel really out of reach and actually kind of unattainable. And so because of this, I think this verse is so encouraging, because I think Paul experienced the same things. And I think it's implied when he writes this verse. And he says, you know what? The reason I can do all these things, the only reason I can actually accomplish what I just told you about, this idea of being content and having defiant joy, the reason I can do this is because of Christ that strengthens me. It's actually because of God's strength. It's actually when I'm relying on God that I can accomplish these things. But I think this verse, I read this, and I think what is implied behind it is that there were times that Paul felt ready to give up as well. There were times where Paul experienced adversity after adversity, where this burden that he was carrying felt too heavy at times for him as well. Maybe it was after a shipwreck. Maybe it was after some beatings that he went through. Maybe it was after one of his sleepless nights. I imagine him crying out to God, asking him, how much longer do I have to go through this? And in the midst of that, Paul experienced a truth that transformed his reality. And it is this, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so as we end this series, I want to encourage you that whatever it has been that have spoken to you, that have encouraged you, I hope and I pray that those times that you feel ready to give up, those times that you feel like you can't do this alone, that you hear the words of Paul that says, neither can I. Neither can I. I can't do this alone. You can't do this alone. And we were never meant to. But actually that you can do all things. You can bear all things. You can stand in the midst of any adversity. Not in your own strength, but because of Jesus who strengthens you. God, I thank you for this book, for these truths that you have spoken into our lives. God, some of us are experiencing some heartaches at the moment. Some of us are experiencing some highlands, some joyful times in our lives. Some of us are experiencing mountaintops at the moment. Some of us are feeling like we're in the valley right now. God, I pray that you just meet every single one of us where we're at today, that you help us, that you strengthen us, God, to actually be able to surrender and to lean on a God that's bigger than our circumstance. God, I pray that you help us to actually take the God-given responsibility that you've given us, the ability to choose our response and fill that gap between event and outcome with a response, God, that will lead to defiant joy. And God, I pray you help us to choose our focus wisely, to focus on what is true and good and noble in our life. And ultimately, God, I pray that you remind us that the only way we can do these things is when you strengthen us, God. And so today we want to lean on you, God. We want to lean into you and pray that you give us joy, that you give us defiant joy in our lives. That regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, that we can stand firm in the joy that you've given us, God. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Oh, how high would I climb mountains if the mountains were where you hide? And oh, how far I'd scale the valleys if you graced the other side. Oh, how long have I chased rivers from lonely seas to where they rise against the rush of grace descending from the source of its supply. 'Cause in the highlands and the heartache, you're neither more or less inclined. I would search and stop at nothing. You're just not that hard to find. So I will praise you on the mountain, and I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. 'Cause you're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadows, and no less faithful when the night leads me astray. 'Cause you're the heaven where my heart is. In the highlands and the heartache all the same. Oh, oh, we sing it out. Whatever I walk through, wherever I am, your name can move mountains. Wherever I stay, if ever I walk through the valley of death, I'll sing through the shadows my song of ascent. Wherever I walk through, wherever I am, your name can move mountains. Wherever I stay, and if ever I walk through the valley of death, I'll sing through the shadows my song of ascent. From the gravest of all valleys come the pastures we call great. A mighty river flowing upwards from a deep but empty grave. So I will praise you on the mountain, and I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadows, no less faithful when the night leads me astray. 'Cause you're the heaven where my heart is, in the highlands and the heartache all the same.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've been encouraged, and I hope through this whole series you've seen that Jesus is our strength. And we as a church really want to help you. We want to help you in your faith journey. And please, if you have any questions about your faith, or if you want to take your next step in your faith journey, please get in touch with us. You can contact us on our website or on social media, or even just out on Church Online, and one of the hosts will get in touch with you. But other than that, this next week, we're still going to be having church all online. So please follow our social media, follow our website for all the latest changes that could possibly happen in this next week. And I'd really like to just take a moment to invite you to be with us next week as we kick off a brand new series titled Human. We're just going to speak about what it really means to be human and how actually God steps into our lives. And it's going to be an encouraging series. I'm going to encourage you to invite a friend maybe over to your house so that you can watch it together, or maybe possibly we'll be back in the building. But stay connected, stay up to date on our website, and we'll see you next week. Have a great weekend.